Captain Jake Morrison stood in the massive hall of Nexus Prime Station and felt very small. The ceiling stretched up so high, he could not see the top through the swirling mists of alien atmosphere. Around him moved creatures from dozens of worlds, each one stranger than the last. Some floated on energy fields while others walked on 6 legs or slithered across the polished floor on smooth bellies. Jake wore his best uniform with all his medals, but he knew it looked simple next to the flowing robes and glowing armor of the alien delegates. Dr. Lisa Rodriguez walked beside him carrying a metal case full of Earth's greatest achievements. Her hand shook just a little as they approached the great doors of the council chamber. The doors opened without a sound, and the 2 humans entered the most important room in the galaxy. Thousands of seats rose in circles around a central platform, where Jake would soon stand and speak for all of humanity. The air hummed with alien voices speaking in languages that hurt his ears and made his teeth itch. Lord Vexus Thera of the Zephyrians called the session to order, with a sound like singing crystal. His blue skin glowed with patterns that meant different things to his people, but Jake could only guess at their meaning. The tall alien looked down at the humans with eyes that held no warmth. Jake walked to the speaking platform on shaking legs. Every eye in the vast chamber focused on him as he began to speak about Earth and its people. He talked about human cities and art and music. He spoke of their science and their desire to join the great community of worlds that made up the Galactic's Alliance. The first sounds of amusement came from the Krex section where reptilian beings hissed with laughter. Jake tried to ignore them and continued his speech about human achievements in space travel and medicine. More laughter joined the first as he described fusion rockets and surgical techniques. Lisa took the platform next and opened her case to show holographic displays of human technology. She explained how humans had split the atom and built computers and mapped their own genetic code. The laughter grew louder as she spoke. Some aliens made sounds that might have been applause, but felt more like mockery. A luminary delegate floated, forward on wings of pure light. Its voice filled the chamber without moving what might have been its mouth. The being spoke of human medicine as crude cutting and poisoning compared to their methods of healing through energy manipulation. It described human technology as barely beyond stone tools. The hegemony representative stood next on its 4 powerful legs. Ambassador Kethmore had skin like polished metal and spoke in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. It called human space travel pathetically slow and their weapons laughably weak. The alien said humans were too violent and unpredictable to ever join civilized society. Jake felt his face burn with shame as more aliens joined in the criticism. They called humans primitive and barbaric. They said human emotions made them unfit for logical decision-making. One delegate suggested that humans might make good servants for more advanced species in a few thousand years. The Zephyrian Lord raised one elegant hand for silence. The chamber fell quiet as Lord Vexithara delivered his judgment on humanity's application. His words cut like ice as he explained that humans were far too young and crude to join the Alliance. Perhaps in several millennia they might qualify as a client species under the protection of their betters. The vote was called, and the results displayed on screens throughout the chamber. Not a single delegate voted to accept humanity into the Alliance. 0 votes in favor and thousands against. The rejection was complete and total. Jake stood frozen on the platform as the aliens began to file out of the chamber. Many stopped to look at the humans with what might have been pity or amusement. A few made sounds that could have been laughter. The Krex delegation hissed as they passed while the Luminari simply ignored the humans. Completely, Lisa packed her case with hands that trembled with anger rather than fear now. Her holographic displays of human achievement flickered and died as she sealed the container. All their preparation and hope had meant nothing to these beings who saw humans as children. Playing with toys. The journey back to their quarters felt endless. Other species gave them a wide path as if failure might be catching. Jake heard whispers in alien languages that probably discussed the amusing display they had just witnessed. The humans who thought they were ready to join the stars. That night, Jake sat alone in his room and wrote his report to Earth. He struggled to find words that could explain the complete dismissal they had faced. How could he tell his people that their greatest achievements were seen as primitive jokes by the rest of the galaxy? Lisa knocked on his door near midnight, holding a bottle of Earth whiskey she had saved for celebration. Instead, they drank it, in bitter silence while staring out at the alien ships docked around Nexus Prime. Each vessel represented technology and knowledge that humanity could not hope to match for centuries. The next morning brought their departure from the station. The same aliens who had laughed at them the day before now ignored them completely. Jake and Lisa were already forgotten as the Council moved on to more important matters between species that actually mattered. Their ship undocked from Nexus Prime and began the long journey back to Earth. Jake watched the station shrink in the rear display until it became just another star in the endless black. Behind them lay the rejection of everything humanity had dreamed of achieving. Ahead waited the task of telling Earth that they were alone in the universe not by choice, but because they were not good enough. The message Jake would carry home was simple and devastating. Humanity had been judged by the greatest powers in the galaxy and found completely wanting. They were too primitive, too violent, and too unpredictable to ever join the community of civilized worlds. The humans who had reached for the stars had been told they belonged in the dirt. Admiral Patricia Wells stared at the displays in Earth's deep space monitoring station and felt ice form in her stomach. 6 months had passed since Jake Morrison returned with news of humanity's rejection by the Galactic Council. Now something, far worse than wounded pride, filled the screens around her. The Outer Rim colonies were going silent one by one. First Kepler Station stopped transmitting, then the mining facility at Wolf 359 went dark. Each loss followed the same pattern of normal communications followed by emergency broadcasts and then nothing at all. Lieutenant Sophie Barnes worked at the main sensor array, trying to make sense of the readings. Her young face was pale as she reported what the instruments showed. Long-range sensors detected massive objects moving between the stars, but they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The ships were like holes cut out of space itself. Dr. Alan Carter hunched over his computer terminal running calculations that made no sense. The approaching vessels were larger than anything in human records, and they moved faster than physics should allow. Their energy signatures were completely unknown, and they left no trace of normal propulsion systems. The first real information came from a badly damaged scout ship that limped back to Earth with news that chilled everyone who heard it. Captain Roy Bennett had been on patrol near the edge of human space when he encountered something impossible. His ship's recorder showed massive black vessels that seemed to eat light and matter. Bennett described creatures that called themselves the Devourers. They did not communicate or negotiate or make any attempt at contact. They simply consumed everything in their path, including planets, stars, and entire species. His patrol group of 6 ships had been reduced to 1 in minutes. Admiral Wells authorized emergency broadcasts to all human colonies, warning them of the approaching threat. The messages were simple and terrifying. Unknown aliens were destroying everything they found, and Earth had no way to stop them. All military vessels were ordered to return to defend the home system. News of the Devourers spread through human space like wildfire. Colony ships changed course to avoid the approaching darkness while military commanders tried to prepare defenses against an enemy they did not understand. Earth's small fleet of warships seemed pathetically inadequate against the force that was consuming the galaxy. The Galactic Council received the same reports from their own territories and reacted with shock and disbelief. Lord Vexthara called emergency sessions as outer worlds fell silent across Zephyrian space. The proud aliens who had mocked human primitiveness found their advanced technology useless against an enemy that absorbed energy weapons. Commander Zethrin led the Zephyrian battle fleet in the first major engagement against the Devourers. His ships carried weapons that could crack planets and shields that could stop small suns. The battle lasted exactly 14 minutes before his entire force was destroyed or consumed. Zethrin escaped in a damaged scout ship to report total defeat. The Luminari tried their psychic abilities against the approaching darkness and found minds that operated on pure hunger, without thought or emotion. Their mental powers that could influence entire populations had no effect on beings that existed only to consume. Entire worlds of peaceful luminary vanished without a trace. The Kreks threw their massive war fleets against the Devourers in battles that lit up entire star systems. Their weapons that could destroy moons barely scratched the black ships that phased through matter, like it was empty space. Battle after battle ended in complete defeat, as the unstoppable force advanced deeper into galactic civilization. Ambassador Kethmore of the Hegemony watched his people's greatest strongholds fall one by one, to an enemy that seemed immune to every weapon they possessed. The metal-skinned aliens who had dismissed human violence as barbaric now wished desperately for any solution to the approaching darkness. Panic spread through the galactic community as species after species fell to the advancing Devourers. Trade routes collapsed as merchant ships were consumed along with their cargo. Communication networks went dark as relay stations disappeared into the hungry void. The Council that had rejected humanity now faced its own extinction. Their advanced civilizations, built on millennia of peace and technological refinement, had no answer for an enemy that simply ate everything it encountered. Diplomatic solutions meant nothing to creatures that did not communicate. Lord Vexus Thera stood in his empty council chamber and felt something he had never experienced before. Fear. The proud Zephyrian who had dismissed human applications with contempt now faced the complete destruction of everything his people had built over thousands of years. The first secret transmission to Earth was sent in desperation. Lord Vexus Thera authorized the message himself, even though it went against everything he believed about galactic hierarchy. The communication was brief and carefully worded to avoid admitting the complete failure of Alliance forces. Admiral Wells received the transmission in her command center and read it with growing amazement. The same aliens who had rejected humanity as too primitive were now asking for help. The message suggested that human perspectives might prove valuable in the current crisis. Jake Morrison read the transmission and felt a bitter smile cross his face. Dr. Lisa Rodriguez stood beside him in the briefing room as Earth's leaders debated whether to help the species that had humiliated them. Some argued that humanity owed the aliens nothing after their treatment. Others pointed out that the Devourers would eventually reach Earth whether the Alliance survived or not. Helping defend the galaxy was really helping defend humanity itself. The debate raged for hours, while reports continued to arrive of worlds falling to the consuming darkness. Outside Earth's orbital defenses, the small human fleet prepared for war against an enemy that had destroyed civilizations far more advanced than their own. Captain Danny Parker drilled his Marines in boarding techniques that no galactic species had used for centuries. Their primitive weapons and crude tactics might be humanity's only chance. The decision finally came from Earth's unified government. Humanity would help defend the galaxy not because the aliens deserved it, but because it was the right thing to do. Admiral Morrison received orders to assemble a volunteer fleet and join the desperate defense of galactic civilization. As human ships prepared to leave Earth's protection and face the Devourers, nobody knew that their rejection by the Council would become the galaxy's salvation. The primitives who had been mocked were about to prove that sometimes old ways work best against new threats. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the ECS Defiance and watched his ragtag fleet approach the Kepler defense line. 20 human ships had volunteered for what everyone expected to be a suicide mission. Their vessels looked crude and primitive next to the elegant alien warships already fighting a losing battle against the Devourers. The flagship Defiance was typical of human design philosophy. Where alien ships were sleek and energy efficient, human vessels were bulky armored, boxes bristling with weapons. Nuclear missiles filled the launch tubes while railguns lined the hull like angry spines. The ship carried enough armor plating to stop a small asteroid. Colonel Danny Parker walked through the Marine Bay, checking his soldiers one final time. His men carried equipment that would have been familiar to warriors from centuries past. Breach, charges, assault rifles, and body armor made from composite materials. The galactic species had abandoned such crude methods long ago in favor of energy weapons and shields. Dr. Lisa Rodriguez worked in her laboratory surrounded by devices that most aliens would consider laughably primitive. Electromagnetic pulse. Generators sat next to chemical explosive warheads. Her team had spent months weaponizing human unpredictability itself. If advanced technology could not stop the Devourers, Perhaps primitive chaos could. Lieutenant Sophie Barnes monitored communications from the defense line, and the reports were grim. 3 more Alliance battle groups had been destroyed in the past hour. The Zephyrian commander was calling for immediate retreat before his entire fleet was consumed by the advancing darkness. The human fleet arrived at the defense line just as another wave of Devourer ships emerged from hyperspace. The black vessels moved like living shadows, absorbing light and matter as they advanced on the desperate Alliance forces. Their phasing technology allowed them to pass through energy barriers as if they did not exist. Commander Zethrin of the Zephyrian Navy contacted Morrison directly with barely concealed desperation in his voice. The proud alien who had once dismissed human technology now begged for any assistance the primitive humans could provide. His own weapons had proven completely useless against the enemy. Morrison studied the tactical displays and saw something the alien commanders had missed. The Devourer ships phased through energy weapons and psychic attacks, but they still had physical mass. Their technology made them nearly invulnerable to advanced galactic weapons, but it might actually make them more vulnerable to older methods. The first human attack came without warning or coordination with Alliance forces. Morrison launched a spread of nuclear torpedoes followed by a barrage of railgun rounds moving at significant fractions of light speed. The primitive weapons struck Devourer ships that had been expecting energy beams and psychic assaults. The results were immediate and devastating. Ships that could phase through energy barriers found themselves unable to avoid solid projectiles traveling at relativistic speeds. Nuclear explosions that would have been absorbed by their dark hulls instead created massive kinetic shockwaves that tore through their formations. Colonel Parker led the first boarding action against a Devourer vessel in galactic history. His Marines used breach charges to blow holes in the enemy hull before storming inside with weapons that fired metal bullets instead of energy beams. The Devourers inside had never faced opponents who fought with such crude directness. The alien crew seemed confused by enemies that used explosive devices and projectile weapons. Their defenses had been designed to counter energy attacks and psychic assaults. Parker's Marines carved through the ship's interior using tactics that were older than space travel itself. Dr. Rodriguez made her most important discovery while analyzing captured Devourer technology. The enemy was indeed a hive mind, as the aliens had suspected, but their collective consciousness was vulnerable to electromagnetic interference. Her primitive EMP weapons could disrupt their coordination in ways that advanced galactic technology could not. News of human success spread through the Alliance fleet like wildfire. Ships that had been preparing to retreat suddenly found new hope as the primitive humans demonstrated that the Devourers could be hurt. Morrison found himself promoted to Supreme Commander of all Allied forces. The transformation of galactic military doctrine happened with desperate speed. Zephyrian ships began mounting primitive kinetic weapons alongside their energy arrays. Luminary commanders learned to coordinate with human EMP strikes to disrupt enemy formations. The Kreks started producing old-style explosive warheads they had not used for centuries. Captain Roy Bennett volunteered to lead the first kamikaze squadron in galactic history. 20 human pilots agreed to ram their ships directly into Devourer capital vessels. The concept horrified alien commanders who valued every life, but Morrison understood that acceptable losses were sometimes necessary for victory. Bennett, S attack succeeded beyond all expectations. The sacrifice of 20 human pilots destroyed a Devourer ship that had single-handedly eliminated an entire Kreks battle group. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous, as the supposedly unstoppable enemy found itself vulnerable to determined sacrifice. Sergeant Maya Foster began training alien soldiers in what humans called fighting dirty. The dignified Luminari learned to set traps and ambushes. The honorable Zephyrians discovered the effectiveness of feints and false retreats. The logical Kreks began to understand the power of bluffing and misdirection. Dr. Rodriguez developed what she called the Chaos Protocol, a strategy that deliberately introduced randomness into fleet movements. Alliance computers struggled with the illogical nature of human tactics, but the Devourers found their predictive algorithms completely useless when faced with decisions that made no mathematical sense. The tide of battle began to shift as more human methods were adopted by Alliance forces. Ships that had relied on elegant technology for millennia learned to fight with crude determination. Energy weapons were supplemented by kinetic projectiles, while psychic attacks were combined with electromagnetic warfare. The Devourers, for the first time in their expansion across multiple galaxies, began to retreat from sectors where human-led forces operated. Their perfect efficiency became a weakness when faced with beautifully imperfect human chaos. Morrison watched his primitive fleet lead the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy to victory. Lord Vexithera contacted Morrison personally to apologize for the Council's earlier treatment of humanity. The proud Zephyrian admitted that his people had been wrong to dismiss human methods as primitive. Sometimes crude solutions worked better than elegant ones when facing an enemy that had adapted to counter-sophistication. The defense of the Kepler line became the first major victory against the Devourers. Human leadership and tactics had saved Alliance forces that were on the verge of complete defeat. The species that had been mocked for their primitiveness were now leading the fight to save galactic civilization itself. Admiral Jake Morrison found himself in command of the largest military force in galactic history. Species that had once mocked humanity now followed his tactical leadership without question. The desperate situation had stripped away centuries of pride and prejudice, leaving only the need to survive against an enemy that consumed everything. The transformation of galactic military doctrine continued at breakneck speed. Zephyrian shipyards worked around the clock to retrofit their elegant vessels with crude human weapons. Railguns and missile tubes were welded onto hulls designed for energy weapons. The beautiful ships looked like mechanical monsters, but they could finally hurt the Devourers. Colonel Danny Parker established training camps on dozens of worlds where human Marines taught alien soldiers how to fight like barbarians. The Luminari, who had floated through battles on wings of pure energy, learned to crawl through mud with explosive charges. Zephyrian officers who commanded through telepathic links practiced shouting orders like human sergeants. Captain Roy Bennett led an expanding force of volunteer pilots from every species in the Alliance. His kamikaze squadrons had proven that determined sacrifice could destroy enemies that seemed invulnerable to conventional attacks. Hundreds of alien pilots volunteered for missions they knew would end in death but might save their worlds. Dr. Lisa Rodriguez worked with scientists from across the galaxy to develop new applications of human chaos theory. The Chaos Protocol had evolved from simple random movement into complex strategies that turned unpredictability into a weapon. Devourer computers that could calculate the movement of entire fleets failed when faced with human-inspired randomness. Lieutenant Sophie Barnes coordinated communications between forces that had never worked together before. Human slang mixed with alien languages as species learned to fight alongside warriors they had previously considered beneath them. The emergency had created a new military culture based on human principles of adaptability and sacrifice. Sergeant Maya Foster found herself training alien special forces in techniques their civilizations had abandoned centuries ago. The art of guerrilla warfare spread through Alliance territories as desperate defenders learned that honor meant nothing to an enemy that only understood consumption. Ambush tactics and improvised weapons became standard throughout the galaxy. The first major counteroffensive began with human forces leading an assault on a Devourer staging area in the Vega system. Morrison's fleet used tactics that would have been considered war crimes by galactic standards. They targeted enemy supply lines, used captured ships as Trojan horses, and employed psychological warfare against a hive mind. The Devourers had never faced opponents who deliberately used their own weaknesses against them. Human commanders ordered damaged ships to ram enemy vessels instead of retreating. They set traps using fake distress signals and turned prisoners of war into double agents. Every dirty trick from human military history was employed against the consuming darkness. Commander Zethrin led a mixed squadron of Zephyrian and human ships in the first successful deep strike against Devourer territory. His elegant vessels had been transformed into crude brawlers armed with nuclear weapons and kinetic bombardment systems. The proud alien commander had learned to think like a human pirate. Dr. Alan Carter made a breakthrough in understanding Devourer technology that changed everything. The enemy ships did not just absorb energy, they converted it into mass to fuel their endless hunger. Human weapons that relied on kinetic impact rather than energy transfer could actually starve the Devourers by denying them the power they needed to regenerate. The revelation spread through Alliance forces and led to a complete reversal of galactic military thinking. Energy weapons that had been the pride of advanced civilizations were abandoned in favor of primitive kinetic projectiles. Scientists who had spent lifetimes perfecting energy shields learned to build armor plating thick enough to stop meteors. Captain Nick Harrison pioneered new boarding techniques that combined human brutality with alien technology. His mixed-species assault teams used teleportation devices to appear inside enemy ships, where they fought with weapons that fired solid projectiles. The confusion caused by materialized enemies with primitive guns was devastating to Devourer crews. The psychological impact of human methods spread beyond the military to civilian populations across the galaxy. Species that had lived in peaceful harmony for millennia learned to hate their enemies with human intensity. The consuming darkness had awakened something primitive in every intelligent being that remembered what it meant to fight for survival. Lord Fexithara found himself learning human curse words as he coordinated defensive operations that would have horrified his ancestors. The dignified Zephyrian leader screamed orders at subordinates and planned attacks that deliberately sacrificed valuable resources for tactical advantage. War had made barbarians of them all. The luminary developed new applications of their psychic abilities based on human emotional intensity. Instead of peaceful mental influence, they learned to project rage and fear directly into enemy minds. Their beautiful telepathic songs became weapons of psychological warfare that could drive Devourer crews to panic. Krex engineers worked with human designers to create hybrid weapons that combined the best of both technologies. Plasma cannons were modified to fire solid projectiles wrapped in energy fields. The resulting weapons could punch through Devourer defenses while delivering maximum kinetic impact. The turning point came when Alliance forces successfully destroyed their first Devourer world ship. The massive vessel had been consuming entire star systems to fuel its advance toward the galactic core. Human-led forces used a combination of nuclear bombardment and kinetic impacts to crack the ship's hull and expose its vital systems to conventional attack. Morrison watched from the bridge of the Defiance as the enemy vessel broke apart in a display of destruction, visible across multiple star systems. The psychological impact was enormous as Devourer forces throughout the galaxy learned that their greatest weapons could be destroyed by determined opponents using primitive methods. The enemy began to change tactics in response to human-led attacks. Devourer ships started avoiding direct confrontation and relied more heavily on stealth and surprise. Their adaptation to human methods proved that the consuming darkness was not as unstoppable as everyone had believed. News of continuing victories spread hope through Alliance territories for the first time since the Devourers had appeared. Refugee fleets began returning to reclaimed systems while industrial production shifted to support the war effort. The galaxy was learning that survival sometimes required embracing methods that civilized beings had tried to forget. The final phase of the war was about to begin as Morrison prepared for an assault on the Devourer home base. The creatures that had consumed multiple galaxies were about to learn that sometimes the most primitive solutions worked best against the most advanced problems. Admiral Jake Morrison stood before the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history and prepared to address beings from every corner of known space. The final assault on the Devourer stronghold would determine whether civilization survived or everything was consumed by the endless hunger that had already devoured multiple galaxies. The enemy had built their staging ground from the remains of consumed worlds. Planets had been stripped down to their cores and reformed into a massive construct that served as both fortress and feeding ground. The structure was larger than most star systems and defended by millions of ships that had never known defeat. Before encountering human tactics, Dr. Lisa Rodriguez made final adjustments to what she had named the Pandora device. The weapon represented everything the Galactic Council had mocked about humanity. Instead of elegant energy manipulation or advanced physics, it relied on something far more primitive and powerful. The device would broadcast human consciousness, itself into the Devourer hive mind. The plan was insane by any measure of galactic military doctrine. Rather than trying to destroy the enemy, humans intended to infect them with individuality. The Devourers had conquered galaxies through perfect, unity and coordination. Rodriguez believed that introducing chaos and independent thought would tear their collective consciousness apart. Lieutenant Commander Nick Harrison volunteered to pilot the delivery ship on what everyone knew was a one-way mission. His vessel had been modified to look like a damaged Devourer ship, complete with false distress signals. The deception would get him close enough to the construct's core to deploy the Pandora device. Colonel Danny Parker led the diversionary assault that would draw Devourer attention away from Harrison's mission. His force of mixed-species Marines had become experts at the kind of close-quarters fighting that the enemy had never learned to counter. They would board the outer stations and fight their way inward, while Harrison approached the core. Captain Roy Bennett commanded the suicide squadrons that would clear a path through the enemy fleet. Hundreds of volunteer pilots from dozens of species had embraced the human concept of acceptable losses. Their sacrifice would create the opening needed for the main assault to succeed. The battle began with a coordinated attack on Devourer outer defenses. Alliance ships using human-inspired tactics struck at enemy formations with weapons that combined primitive kinetic force with advanced targeting systems. Nuclear warheads detonated among ships that had expected energy-based attacks. Morrison watched from the Defiance as his forces engaged an enemy that still outnumbered them by millions to one. The Devourers had learned to counter some human methods, but they still could not predict the chaotic decision-making that turned every battle into a gambling match where logic meant nothing. Bennett led his kamikaze pilots in the largest suicide attack in galactic history. Wave after wave of volunteer ships rammed into Devourer vessels while screaming battle cries in languages from across the galaxy. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage as the enemy learned that some beings would die rather than be consumed. Parker escorting teams fought their way through enemy installations using tactics that would have horrified their ancestors. Zephyrian officers used human curse words while coordinating attacks that deliberately sacrificed valuable equipment for tactical advantage. Luminary psychics projected pure hatred instead of their traditional peaceful emotions. The Chaos Protocol reached its ultimate expression as Alliance forces abandoned all pretense of civilized warfare. Ships that had been designed for elegant combat became brawlers that used every dirty trick human military history could provide. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations fought like barbarians because barbarian methods worked. Harrison*'s ship slipped through the battle unnoticed while disguised as damaged enemy vessel. His false distress signals convinced Devourer patrols to escort him toward the construct's core, where repair facilities waited. The deception held until he was within striking distance of his target. Dr. Rodriguez monitored the Pandora device from her laboratory aboard the Defiance. The weapon contained recordings of human thoughts and emotions from millions of people across Earth. Every dream, hope, fear, and individual desire had been compressed into a signal that would be broadcast directly into the Devourer collective consciousness. The moment of truth came when Harrison reached the construct's core and activated the device. His final transmission carried across the battlefield as he spoke words that would be remembered throughout galactic history. He told Earth that the primitives had saved the galaxy and activated the weapon that would prove him right. The Pandora device worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The signal carrying human individuality struck the Devourer hive mind like a virus spreading through a computer network. Millions of beings that had never experienced independent thought suddenly found themselves questioning everything they had ever known. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the enemy. Ships that had moved in perfect coordination began to break formation as individual Devourers started making their own decisions. The consuming hunger that had driven them across galaxies was replaced by curiosity about who they might become as individuals. Within hours, the mighty Devourer fleet had turned on itself as newly awakened individuals questioned the purpose of their existence. Some chose to help repair the damage they had caused, while others simply wandered into deep space to discover what it meant to be alone with their thoughts. The construct that had seemed impregnable began to collapse as its operators abandoned their posts to explore their new individual consciousness. Systems that had functioned perfectly under collective control failed when operated by beings learning to think for themselves. Morrison watched in amazement as the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known defeated itself through the simple gift of human individuality. The species that consumed everything they encountered had been transformed by exposure to the chaotic beauty of independent thought. The aftermath of victory found the galactic community forever changed by their contact with human methods. Lord Vexithera stood in the council chambers on Nexus Prime and formally apologized to Morrison for their earlier treatment of humanity. The proud Zephyrian admitted that wisdom did not always come with age and sophistication. Dr. Rodriguez addressed the Council as humanity's representative in negotiations for full Alliance membership. Her message was simple but firm. Humans would join as equals with their own perspective on how the galaxy should be protected. The days of junior partnerships and client species were over. The treaty ceremony established Earth's first embassy on Nexus Prime with Morrison as humanity's first official ambassador. The plaque by the entrance honored those who had proved that strength came from being beautifully and chaotically human rather than coldly perfect. Children from dozens of species now played together in the embassy gardens while their parents attended classes at human military academies. Courses on creative problem-solving and tactical unpredictability had become the most sought-after education in the galaxy. The species that had once mocked humanity now sent their finest students to learn from the primitives who had saved them all. The galaxy had learned that sometimes salvation came from those who were least expected to provide it, and that chaos could be more powerful than perfect order.